Well, it is good to be back with you after some time away for rest and renewal. As some of you are aware, part of that time was spent 14 years of marriage to my wife, Marion. We observed our anniversary back on June 25th. In fact, that's the way we began our vacation. We spent a few days at the beach without our children for the first time since, before having them. And when you've been taking children to the beach off and on for approximately 10 years, you tend to notice some things when you're without them, like how incredibly relaxed you are about everything, and how few things you seem to have to haul to you going to and from the beach, and quite frankly, how much more you seem to smile than everyone else. But I did notice something else too, or rather, I was reminded of it. And that is how different Marion and I tend to vacation. Now, while she would like to sit on the beach all day and take in the sun, I need to know where we're going and what we're going to be doing next. While she'd prefer let the day sort of come to us, I'd prefer schedule the day well in advance. To put it differently, while Marion wants to simply be on vacation, I like to go on vacation. In fact, if we wanted to categorize it with regard to our reading today, you might say that there are sort of Mary vacations and Martha vacations. You know what I mean. I suspect you've experienced both, perhaps even this summer. Some folks love to take time away during which they see 6 European countries in 6 days. Or they only have 2 weeks to engage in every possible outdoor activity they can fit in. Rest? I can rest when I'm home, when I get back from vacation, they'll say. Other folks, though, they want to get away from it all. For them, it's about sitting by the lake and doing absolutely nothing. It's about serenity and contemplation and quiet relaxation. Why would we go anywhere else when we can stay right here, they would say. Now, don't get me wrong, one is no better than the other. They're just different. One puts a premium upon rest and rejuvenation, the other upon adventure and surprise. Either can be a means of renewal. And while it's not a universal truth, my observation is that folks usually plan their vacations in contrast to the way they live their everyday lives. Those who sit in an office behind a desk week in and week out tend to plan vacations that allow them to get out and experience the world. Those who have those high stress level jobs, constantly under pressure to produce and to perform, tend to plan those vacations with very little agenda or responsibility. The point is, vacations, at least in part, are meant to bring a sense of balance back into our lives. The Martha in us needs a little more Mary. Mary in us could use a little more Martha. Which, if I'm honest, I'm not sure I'm all that good at these days. I once had a mentor tell me that when preparing a sermon on a text, to always start with what you struggle with in that reading. He said, I suspect if you're wrestling with it, your congregants are too. Family, work, friends, faith, self. It's a kind of juggling act for us all, isn't it? We're constantly faced with those dilemmas like, do I go on a date with just my spouse tonight, or do we invite some friends to come along? Do I go to church on Sunday morning at the end of an exhausting week, or do I sleep in and try to catch up on that rest before the coming week? Do I go outside and play with my child in the late afternoon, or do I finish up those last few emails so that I can be better prepared for the next day? We all struggle to find balance because we all tend to favor either the Mary or the Martha in our lives. Or at least that's my experience, especially serving the church. I have a colleague who was pastor of a Lutheran church in the Midwest. He told me about the most peculiar stained glass window in their sanctuary. He said it's supposed to be depicting the story of Mary and Martha. In fact, the window pane even references our scripture reading today, Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. The only problem is that the only person depicted in the scene is Martha. No Mary, no Jesus. Just Martha standing there with a wooden spoon. It's no wonder my people think they constantly have to be doing something, he says. It's true, isn't it? There are those who believe the church should be more like Martha, always busy serving at the soup kitchen or preparing communion or doing a craft with kids during VBS. And there are those who feel we're to be more like Mary, studying the Bible and praying for the world and listening to sermons. While I would suspect we would all agree that both are important parts of being the church, most of us likely suggest that one is better or more important than the other. Or at least Jesus certainly seems to in our reading this morning. Mary has chosen the better part, he says. It's no wonder that throughout history, art has depicted Mary and Martha snarling at one another. I mean, someone still has to set the table and cook the meal and serve the food. In fact, it's not just caused resentment in the Marthas among us, it's fundamentally hard to believe, isn't it? After all, there's not a lot of sitting around in the Gospels, is there? Jesus is always calling people to get up and to follow him, to give a cup of cold water in his name, to reach out to those in need, to go and to do and to work and to act. In fact, it's not just what Jesus seems to emphasize, but what we seem to value in our culture too. Production and work ethic and efficiency. Why else would we drive and text and eat our lunch all at the same time? Or run on the treadmill and read over documents for work all while talking on the phone to our mother? Or grade papers and cook dinner and try to catch up with our spouse? Or have that Zoom business meeting in a crowded Starbucks while listening to music and studying for our upcoming night class? Or receiving chemotherapy on our lunch hour in order to not miss that afternoon appointment and still have time to get home and get the kids off the bus? The truth is, many of us know quite a bit about Martha because, well, she plays a very important role. But Jesus says it's Mary. That Mary's chosen the better part. I can remember being at a pastor's conference a few years ago when during a workshop, the director of the Week of Compassion at the time said something like this. You know, there's a difference between being busy and doing mission. He went on to make the point that oftentimes we get so caught up in the details of ministry that we forget to reflect on why we do what we do, not only in the church, but in every aspect of our lives. In other words, we can get so caught up in the work of ministry that we fail to notice God's presence in our very midst. His point was, it's not that one is better than the other, but rather that both are needed. Which is the reason many scholars suggest we might do well to focus less on the better in Jesus' words here, and more on the part. After all, in the Greek, this little phrase is more appropriately translated that Mary is not playing a better part, but a good part. In other words, it's not that Martha's doing anything bad. It's simply different. Jesus needs both. And so do we. Which is difficult for us to acknowledge these days, I realize. That most of the time it's not an either or, but rather a both and. Like conservatives needing liberals, and liberals needing conservatives. Like Christians needing Muslims, and Muslims needing Christians. And Americans needing Iranians, and Iranians needing Americans. It's almost as if the term is disappearing from our language altogether. When was the last time you heard, except with reference to a budget, the word balance? Several years ago now, Tom Friedman had a column on the op-ed page of the New York Times entitled "The Taxi Driver." He told of being driven by a cab from the airport into downtown Paris. During the 1-hour trip, he and the driver had done 6 different things. The driver had driven the cab, talked on his cell phone, and watched a video, which was quite frankly scary, whereas he'd been riding in the cab, working on a column on his laptop, and listening to music in his phone. Friedman wrote, "There was only one thing we never did, and that was talk to each other." Jesus' response to Martha is not one of rebuke for Martha's activity in the kitchen. It's a reminder to not get so caught up in the activity of our lives that we forget to talk and to listen to God and, well, for that matter, each other. It's not that one is better than another. We need activity and we need contemplation. We need the balance of both in this life. Over and over again, the one thing I hear, almost without exception from you these days, from us, is the stress and anxiety in our voices around all of which we feel compelled to do. Kids have to study and go to music practice and play in their sporting event and get to youth group. The parents have to go to work and get their kids to all these activities and somehow find time to spend time with their spouses and their friends. And I even hear retired people these days saying, "I just stay so busy, I don't have time for myself." It's such a simple idea, but so difficult in practice. Putting Mary and Martha to work in our lives. Recognizing that both are good parts. The 12th century monastic Bernard of Clairvaux made the observation that Mary and Martha live in the same house, part of the same household. They're both part of the same essential Christian experience. A couple years ago, I remember hearing a stand-up bit during which the comedian said that if he could be any superhero in the world, he'd be Pay Attention Man. If you're sitting at a red light and the light turns green but the car in front of you won't move, Pay Attention Man would leap into action, knock at the window of the car moving in front of you and say to the driver, "Hey man, pay attention." It was funny when I heard it, I promise. In order to find this balance in our lives, we've got to pay attention. Be mindful and intentional about how we live our lives in every aspect. When having discourse about politics, are we inviting balance into the conversation we're having? As we move toward a new school year and a different pace of life, are we making space for more balance in our schedule and our daily routines? As we vision for the future of our church, are we balancing the planning and preparing with the listening and the praying? Mary and Martha both are essential to the Christian life. God invites us to both action and to contemplation. Not as separate states or activities, but as two much-loved sisters who need each other in order to faithfully serve their God. Which means the better part is usually not either or. It's usually both and.